For most of human history, getting lost meant dying. Not the kind of lost that means you take a wrong turn on a highway and arrive somewhere 20 minutes late. The kind of lost that means you are standing in the middle of an ocean with no land visible in any direction, or crossing a featureless desert where every dune looks exactly like the last one, or pushing through a forest so thick and so vast that the sun itself cannot tell you which way you are facing. The kind of lost where the word lost and the word dead are separated by nothing more than time. For thousands of years, every sailor who pushed beyond the sight of familiar coastline, every caravan merchant who left the known roads behind, every soldier marching through unfamiliar territory was betting their life on their ability to find their way, using the stars when the sky was clear, using the feel of the wind and the color of the water and the behavior of birds and 100 other fragile, unreliable, impermanent signs that could vanish the moment the clouds rolled in or the wind changed direction. And then someone in ancient China picked up a piece of dark, heavy, ordinary-looking stone and noticed something extraordinary about it. The stone was magnetite, also known as lodestone, a naturally occurring magnetic mineral found in certain rocky regions across the ancient world. People had known about lodestone for a very long time. The ancient Greeks wrote about it. The ancient Indians described it. The Romans used the word magnes to describe it, from which our word magnet eventually descended. It was considered curious and slightly mysterious, a stone that could attract iron, that seemed to reach out and grab certain metals with an invisible force that nobody could see or explain. It was the kind of thing that philosophers wrote about and children found fascinating and practical people generally set aside as interesting but not particularly useful. But in China, sometime around the 3rd or 4th century BC, someone made a connection that nobody had made before. Or rather, someone noticed something that the stone did which nobody had thought to pay careful attention to before. When magnetite was floated on water or balanced on a smooth surface so that it could rotate freely, it did not spin randomly. It settled. It pointed. Consistently, reliably, persistently, regardless of where you were standing or which direction you had been traveling or what the weather was. One end of the magnetic stone pointed toward the north and the other end pointed toward the south. The invisible force that made lodestone attract iron was also, it turned out, connected to something far larger and far more fundamental than anyone had imagined. It was connected to the Earth itself. The Earth, as we now understand, generates a massive magnetic field produced by the movement of molten iron in its outer core, a field so large that it extends tens of thousands of miles into space around the planet. And lodestone, sitting on the surface of the Earth, aligns itself with that field the way a compass needle still aligns itself today. The stone was not just a curiosity. It was a receiver, a listener, a tiny, dark, heavy piece of iron ore that was silently, constantly, perfectly in tune with a force running through the entire planet beneath it. The Chinese did not know about the Earth's magnetic field. They had no concept of planetary cores or magnetic flux lines or the physics that we use today to explain what they were observing. But they did not need to know the explanation to use the observation. And the Chinese, above all ancient civilizations, were supremely gifted at taking an observation and finding a use for it. The first recorded use of this magnetic property in China was not for navigation. It was for something that might seem, from a modern perspective, far less practical, but that made perfect sense within the framework of ancient Chinese thought and society. The first use was for geomancy, the ancient Chinese practice of feng shui, which sought to align buildings, tombs, cities, and sacred spaces with the natural forces of the earth and cosmos in ways that would bring harmony, prosperity, and good fortune. The proper orientation of a building or a burial site was considered enormously important, and being able to reliably identify south, which was the most auspicious direction in Chinese cosmological thinking, was enormously valuable. The earliest Chinese magnetic direction-finding device was called a xinun, and it was a beautiful and elegant thing. It consisted of a polished bronze plate engraved with the cardinal directions and various cosmological symbols, and a small spoon-shaped piece of lodestone balanced on its rounded bottom on the smooth bronze surface so that it could rotate freely. The spoon would spin when disturbed and then settle with its handle pointing consistently southward. It was not a navigation instrument in the way we think of a compass today. It was a tool for divination and spatial orientation, for making sure that a house faced the right direction, that a grave was aligned correctly, that a new city was laid out in harmony with the forces that the ancient Chinese believed flowed through the landscape. But the knowledge that magnetic stone always pointed in the same direction was out in the world now. And knowledge, once it exists, has a way of finding new applications that its original discoverers never anticipated. The journey from the diviner's spoon to the sailor's compass took centuries, and it happened not in a single moment of inspiration but through a long, gradual process of experimentation and refinement that unfolded across generations of Chinese scholars, craftsmen, soldiers, and eventually sailors. The key development was the discovery that the magnetic property of lodestone could be transferred to iron. If you stroked a needle of iron against a piece of lodestone repeatedly and in the right direction, the needle would itself become magnetized. It would behave just like the lodestone, aligning itself with the Earth's magnetic field when allowed to move freely. And an iron needle was infinitely more practical than a heavy polished lodestone spoon. It was lighter. It was smaller. It could be floated on a piece of wood in a bowl of water, or suspended on a silk thread, or balanced on a pin, and in each of these forms it would do the same faithful, reliable thing. It would point south. The Chinese military was among the first to recognize the navigational potential of this magnetized needle technology. Ancient Chinese texts from around the 9th and 10th centuries AD described the use of magnetic needles for directional guidance on land. Soldiers in unfamiliar territory using the needle to maintain their orientation when clouds covered the stars and the landscape gave no clear directional cues. The military application was practical and immediately obvious. An army that could navigate reliably in any weather and any terrain had an enormous advantage over one that was dependent on stars and landmarks and local guides. But it was the sailors who would ultimately take the compass and use it to change the world. Chinese seafarers had been sailing the coastal waters of East Asia for thousands of years, and by the first millennium AD they were venturing increasingly far from familiar shores. Trading routes across the South China Sea, expeditions to Southeast Asia and eventually to India and beyond. These open water voyages were possible but dangerous, dependent on the monsoon winds that blew predictably in different directions at different seasons, and on the stars for nighttime navigation. When the sky was clear and the stars were visible, an experienced navigator could maintain a reliable course. But the sky is not always clear. Storms blow in and close off the stars for days at a time. The South China Sea is one of the most typhoon-prone bodies of water on Earth, and a navigator caught in heavy weather with no stars, no familiar landmarks, and no way to determine direction was in serious and immediate trouble. By the 11th century AD, Chinese maritime texts were describing the routine use of magnetized needles for navigation at sea. A needle floated on water or suspended on a thread would point south regardless of the weather, regardless of the time of day or night, regardless of how far the ship had traveled from familiar waters. A navigator using a magnetic compass did not need the stars to be visible, did not need to recognize landmarks, did not need the wind to blow from a particular direction. They needed only to look at their needle, note which way it pointed, and steer accordingly. For the first time in the history of seafaring, reliable directional navigation was possible in any weather, at any time, anywhere on the ocean. The compass reached the Islamic world through the busy trade networks that connected China to the Middle East across the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean. Arab navigators and scholars encountered the Chinese magnetic needle technology sometime in the 12th century, adopted it with their characteristic practical intelligence, and began using it in their own extensive maritime trading operations that stretched from the Persian Gulf across the Indian Ocean to the coasts of East Africa and South and Southeast Asia. Arab sailors refined the compass further, developing the dry pivot compass, a needle balanced on a pin rather than floated on water, which was more stable in rough seas and easier to use on a moving ship. They combined compass navigation with their sophisticated existing knowledge of celestial navigation, tidal patterns, and ocean winds to create a navigational tradition that was the most advanced in the world during the medieval period. From the Arab world, the compass made its way to Europe. Medieval European sailors and merchants had been trading with Arab merchants and occasionally encountering Arab navigational technology for centuries, and by the late 12th and early 13th centuries, references to magnetic compass use were beginning to appear in European texts, first in Mediterranean maritime contexts, then gradually spreading northward through the Atlantic seagoing nations. The European encounter with the compass came at a historically precise moment. European maritime technology and ambition were both expanding rapidly. The great Mediterranean trading powers, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, were pushing their commercial networks further and further, and the Atlantic nations of Portugal, Spain, and England were beginning to look beyond the familiar coastlines of Europe toward the open ocean with a combination of fear and longing that was about to be transformed, by the compass among other technologies, into something history has never quite seen before or since. Portuguese navigators, funded by the Portuguese crown and driven by a combination of commercial ambition, religious mission, and pure exploratory hunger, began systematically pushing south and west into previously uncharted waters in the early 15th century. They had the compass. They had improving ship designs. They had accumulated navigational knowledge from Arab, Jewish, and Mediterranean sources. And they had, crucially, the systematic support of a state that recognized the strategic and commercial value of what they were doing and funded it accordingly. Under the patronage of Prince Henry, who history remembers as Henry the Navigator despite the fact that he himself rarely went to sea, Portuguese explorers pushed further and further down the African coast. Past Cape Bojador, which had long been considered the southern limit of the navigable world, past the Great Bulge of West Africa. Further south until in 1488 Bartholomew Diaz rounded the southernmost tip of the African continent and sailed into the Indian Ocean, opening the sea route to Asia that changed the balance of global trade forever. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the full voyage, from Portugal around Africa to India and back, proving that the sea route was commercially viable and establishing the Portuguese as the dominant naval power in the Indian Ocean, breaking the Arab and Venetian monopoly on the spice trade that had controlled the flow of wealth between Europe and Asia for centuries. And in 1492, sailing for the Spanish crown, an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus used his compass to sail west across the Atlantic Ocean, maintaining his course across thousands of miles of open water with no landmarks and no visible stars for days at a time, until he made landfall in the Caribbean and opened the connection between the Old World and the New World that reshaped the entire human story. None of these voyages would have been possible without the compass. Not in the form they took, at the speed they happened, with the reliability and the confidence that made them commercially viable rather than simply heroic but unrepeatable acts of individual courage. The compass made systematic ocean navigation possible. It made the open ocean navigable not just by exceptional navigators on exceptional days but by ordinary sailors following reliable instruments. It turned the ocean from a barrier into a road that went everywhere and belonged to everyone who had a ship and the courage to sail it. The stone that a Chinese diviner balanced on a bronze plate to find the auspicious direction for a burial tomb became, across 2,000 years of use and refinement and transmission across cultures and continents, the instrument that made the modern world. The invisible force that a lodestone listened to in a quiet Chinese workshop became the force that drove Portuguese ships around Africa and Spanish ships across the Atlantic and English ships into every ocean on Earth. The compass did not just change navigation. It changed everything. It changed which civilizations grew rich and which grew poor, which peoples came into contact with which other peoples, which diseases spread where, which languages became global, which religions crossed oceans, which goods and ideas and creatures and plants moved from one part of the earth to another. It changed the map. Permanently. Completely. Irreversibly. And it all began with someone in ancient China doing something that seemed, at the time, quite small. They picked up a dark, heavy, ordinary-looking piece of stone. They balanced it carefully on a smooth surface. They watched it turn. They watched it settle. And then they watched it do the same thing again. And again. And again. Pointing south every single time, with a calm and absolute reliability that felt, in a world of uncertainty and chaos and the constant danger of getting lost, like nothing short of a miracle. It was not a miracle. It was the earth speaking. Sending a signal through the rock and the iron and the invisible lines of force that wrap around the entire planet, reaching up through the surface and into the hands of anyone paying close enough attention to feel it. The Chinese paid attention. They listened. And the world was never the same again.